The boy asked the question so quietly that John Shepard almost did not hear it over the crackling of the fire. Almost. But the words landed on him like a brand against bare skin, and he felt them sear all the way down to the marrow of his bones. The child, no more than 7 years old, sat across the flames with his knees pulled up to his chest, and his dark eyes fixed on John with the kind of desperate searching that only a fatherless boy could manage. The camp was quiet around them. The horses shifted at their tethers. The Arizona desert exhaled its night breath, dry and ancient and indifferent to the small drama unfolding beside a dying fire somewhere outside the town of Tucson in the autumn of 1881. The boy had asked, "Mr. Shepard, is my mama going to be all right?" And John had looked at that child, that small brave child who had not cried once in 3 days of hard riding, who had eaten without complaint whatever miserable scraps John could provide, who had pressed himself against his mother's unconscious body each night for warmth, and refused to leave her side, and he had felt something break open in the center of his chest that he was absolutely certain had been sealed shut for years. He reached across the fire and set his calloused, road-worn hand on the boy's shoulder. "Your mama," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by something he had no name for, "is the strongest person I have ever come across on any road." The boy studied him. "But is she going to be all right?" John looked over at the woman lying beneath his bedroll, her dark hair spread across the folded saddle blanket he had placed beneath her head, her breathing shallow but steady, her face even in unconsciousness carrying that particular fierce expression he had noticed the very first moment he laid eyes on her, 3 weeks ago, in a town that should have been safe and was not. "Yes," he said, and for the first time in a long while he meant something completely. He had not always been a man whose word meant something. That was the part of the story he would spend the rest of his life trying to reckon with. He had ridden roads across Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California with nothing but a horse and a bedroll and a dark past that followed him as faithfully as a shadow follows a man at noon. He had made promises he did not keep. He had left people behind. He had ridden away from obligations that pressed too heavily against the hollow feeling he carried everywhere, the feeling that had started when he was 22 years old and watched everything he had built crumble into ash and betrayal. But before any of that, before the fire and the desert and the dying fire and the boy's desperate question, there was the morning he rode into the town of Redemption, New Mexico, and saw Maggie Walker for the first time. Redemption was not its actual name. The actual name was Harlow's Crossing, named for a cattle rancher named Elias Harlow who had died of fever 3 years prior and left behind a complicated legacy and a small settlement of perhaps 200 souls hanging on to the edge of the desert with both hands and a great deal of stubbornness. John had a habit of renaming places in his head. It was a private habit, known to no one of the small harmless ways he organized a world that mostly refused to behave sensibly. He had ridden into Harlow's Crossing on a Tuesday in early September of 1881, on a bay horse named Franklin who had terrible manners and excellent endurance. He was not planning to stay. He never planned to stay anywhere. His plan, to the extent that a man who had abandoned planning could be said to have one, was to ride through, purchase supplies, water his horse, and continue west toward California, where he had a vague notion that the Pacific Ocean might represent some kind of terminal point to all the directionless riding. He was 31 years old. He had been riding for 9 years. He was extraordinarily tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He was tying Franklin to the rail outside the general store when he heard the argument. It was not an argument in the shouting sense, not at first. It was the controlled, brittle kind of argument that two people have when one of them is trying very hard to remain dignified and the other is holding all the cards and knows it. The voices came from inside the store, and John, who genuinely intended to mind his own business, paused with his hand on Franklin's reins because something in the woman's voice stopped him cold. Not because it was loud, because it was not. Because it was the voice of someone who had made a private commitment to themselves never to beg out loud, no matter what, and was currently being pushed to the very outermost edge of that commitment. He went inside. The general store was dim and smelled of leather and tobacco and the particular dusty sweetness of bulk flour. Behind the long wooden counter stood a man John would later learn was named Gerald Croft, who owned the store and several other properties in Harlow's Crossing, and who carried the specific brand of comfortable corruption that grows in small places, where one man holds enough debt over enough people to operate without meaningful consequence. Croft was perhaps 50, wide through the shoulders, with a neatly kept mustache and eyes that moved like a man calculating things constantly. Standing on the other side of the counter was Maggie Walker. John's first impression was of economy and precision. She was not particularly tall, perhaps 5'4", with dark brown hair pinned back severely from a face that was angular and striking rather than conventionally pretty, with high cheekbones and a wide mouth currently pressed into a very thin line. She wore a dark blue dress that had been mended at least twice at the cuffs, and a pair of boots that had seen considerable use. She held herself with the posture of someone who had learned that the world respected upright people slightly more than it respected people who appeared diminished, and had decided to always appear upright regardless of internal conditions. Beside her, clinging to her hand with both of his, was a small boy with his mother's dark eyes and his mother's same quality of contained intensity, currently watching the man behind the counter with an expression of undisguised suspicion that was remarkable in a child who John would later determine was 6 years old at the time. "The price was 42 cents last month, Mr. Croft," Maggie Walker said in that controlled voice that John had heard from the street. "I have 42 cents. "Prices change," Croft said with the comfortable ease of a man who has never had to apologize for anything. "Flour's up, everything's up, you want the sack or not. I want it at the price we agreed." "We didn't agree anything. You came in and you bought flour. That's a transaction, not an agreement." The boy pressed closer to his mother's leg. Maggie Walker did not look down at him. She kept her eyes on Croft, and John watched her jaw tighten with the effort of holding her composure. "I have 42 cents, she said again. "I also have outstanding credit here which you yourself extended to me when my husband died and which I have been paying down by 15 cents a month for the past 11 months. By my accounting, I have been a reliable—" "Your accounting isn't my accounting," Croft said pleasantly. "And your credit situation is exactly why I'm not extending you the price from last month, Mrs. Walker. You're a liability. Flour's 60 cents. You've got 42. Come back when you've got 60. John had been standing just inside the doorway during this exchange. He had no particular intention when he stepped forward. He simply found himself doing it, the way a man sometimes acts before his brain has formally decided to act. He set 2 dimes on the counter beside Maggie Walker's coins without saying anything. She turned and looked at him, and he got his first full look at her face, and he experienced something he had no framework for, a sudden, disorienting clarity, as though something that had been blurry for a very long time had abruptly come into focus. "I don't take charity," she said immediately. Not unkindly, as a statement of fact. "It's not charity," John said. "You clearly had a deal. He's changing the terms after the fact. That's a cheat. I have a personal objection to cheats." Croft's comfortable expression shifted slightly. He looked at John with new attention, taking in the road-worn quality of him, the Colt revolver on his hip, the particular stillness of a man who has spent years in circumstances requiring stillness. "I don't know you," Croft said. "No," John agreed. "You don't." There was a pause that stretched several seconds. Then Croft took the coins off the counter, all of them, and disappeared through a back curtain to retrieve the flour. Maggie Walker looked at John with an expression he could not fully read, which was part of what made it interesting. There were layers to it. Gratitude, yes, but pushed down and partially obscured by something more complicated, a kind of resentment that she seemed to immediately recognize as unfair and was actively arguing with internally. And beneath both of those, something else he would not have words for until much later. "Thank you," she said, with the precision of someone who gives thanks genuinely rather than automatically. "I'll pay you back the 18 cents. I'll be gone before you have the chance," he said. He genuinely believed that when he said it, the boy looked up at him. "Where are you going?" "West," John said. "West is a big place," the boy said gravely. "It is," John agreed. "What's your name?" "Thomas Walker," the boy said, with the same quality of dignity his mother had. "My mama named me after my grandfather. He was a very brave man who fought in the war." "Which war?" John asked. "The big one," Thomas said. Maggie Walker retrieved the flower from Croft when he returned, tucked it under one arm without looking at John again, said thank you again to the general air of the store in a way that encompassed him without focusing on him, took Thomas's hand and walked out. John watched her go and then ordered the supplies he had come for, and absolutely did not think about her the entire time he was loading up Franklin and checking his saddle cinch and pointing himself west out of Harlow's Crossing. He made it approximately 4 miles before he stopped. He sat on Franklin in the middle of the road, in the dry September heat, with nothing around him but scrub and rock and the distant purple suggestion of mountains, and he thought about that woman's voice. Not her face, though her face was present in his thinking too, but specifically her voice. The precision and control of it, the absolute refusal to collapse under pressure that had been audible in every word. He thought about the boy with his mother's eyes asking where he was going. West is a big place. He turned Franklin around. He told himself he was turning around because he had forgotten to purchase salt, which was true. He had in fact forgotten salt. He did not examine the reasoning beyond that. He purchased the salt. And while he was purchasing the salt, he asked Harriet Chen, who worked behind the counter while Croft was out making other people's lives difficult, whether she knew anything about the Walker woman. Harriet Chen was 43 years old, had been in Harlow's Crossing for 12 years, and had the look of a person who has survived enough to be honest about most things. She was one of the few Chinese women in the territory, had come west with her husband who had worked the railroads, had stayed when he was killed in an accident on the line, and had made a place for herself through sheer force of reliability. She regarded John's question with frank assessment. "Maggie Walker," she said, "is one of the more remarkable women in this territory, though nobody gives her credit for it because she's poor and a widow, and has that way of looking at people that makes them uncomfortable." "What way?" "Like she can see what they actually are rather than what they want her to see," Harriet said. "People don't like that, Gerald Croft especially." John asked why Croft especially. Harriet leaned on the counter. Her husband, Robert Walker, died 14 months ago. Horse through him, broke his neck. Before he died, he was trying to establish a small farm east of town. Good land. Croft's been working to get his hands on that land ever since, because the creek that runs through it is the only reliable water source for a good piece of property Croft also owns. Maggie's been holding on. Her and Thomas in that farmhouse working that land. She grows vegetables, keeps chickens, trades labor with the Navarro family 2 miles south. She's managing, just barely, but she's managing. John thought about the flour. 60 cents. The comfortable way Croft had moved the price. "Is Croft escalating?" he asked. Harriet looked at him steadily. "He's been patient because he thinks she'll break on her own eventually, but things have been moving faster lately. Couple of his men have been out near her property more often. Nothing she can directly report to the marshal, but—" "Is there a marshal?" "There's a marshal named Dave Pullman who is Gerald Croft's cousin by marriage," Harriet said, with the specific flatness of someone delivering information they find profoundly unsatisfying. John bought his salt. He also bought a second sack of flour, an extra pound of coffee, a tin of baking powder, and a small paper packet of stick candy. He did not examine this purchasing behavior either. He rode east out of town, in the direction of the farm. Finding it was not difficult. Harriet's directions were clear, and the land was specific in the way desert land often is, particular arrangements of rock and brush that served as landmarks. He found the farm as the sun was moving into late afternoon, turning everything that ochre gold that made even bare desert look briefly beautiful. It was a modest place, a one-room adobe house with a second small room built on, a fenced garden area that was doing better than he expected, a small barn containing 2 chickens, a milk cow and a mule named as he would learn Senator. Maggie Walker was in the garden when he rode up, and she straightened from her work and looked at him with an expression that contained absolutely no surprise, which surprised him. "I figured you'd come back," she said. "Why?" he asked, genuinely curious. She studied him. "You have the look of a man who doesn't know what he's looking for but recognizes it when he's in its vicinity." He sat on Franklin and looked at her and did not have a response to that. "I brought supplies," he said finally, "from town. You don't have to take them if you don't want to. I can leave them on the ground and ride off and we can both pretend this was a coincidence." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile but in the direction of one. "What kind of supplies?" he told her. She looked at him for a long moment, her hands still carrying traces of garden dirt, her dark eyes doing that thing Harriet had described, seeing what he actually was rather than what he wanted her to see. He found, somewhat to his surprise, that he did not find this uncomfortable. He had spent years making himself into something opaque enough that most people did not look at him too closely. It was strange and not entirely unpleasant to encounter a gaze that went right through the opacity as though it were not there. "There's a post on the east side of the barn where you can tie your horse," she said. "Thomas will want to talk to you. I hope you don't mind children." "I don't have much experience with them," he said honestly. "He's not a typical child," she said, which seemed to be a statement of fact rather than a boast. "Come inside when you're ready. I'll make coffee." She turned back to her garden. He tied Franklin, unloaded the supplies, and stood for a moment in the fading gold light of the afternoon, feeling something he would eventually identify as the beginning of being somewhere rather than simply passing through. Thomas Walker was, as advertised, not a typical child. He was waiting inside the house with a book open on his lap, which was the 1876 edition of a general encyclopedia he had clearly read multiple times, based on the condition of the binding. He looked up at John with eyes that contained 6 years of intense observation and said, with perfect seriousness, "Are you staying?" "I'm not sure yet," John said. Thomas seemed to find this acceptable. "Mama said you probably wouldn't stay. She said men like you usually move on." "Men like me. Men with sad eyes who are kind anyway," Thomas said, returning to his encyclopedia. "She says those are the best kind but the hardest to keep." John sat at the small table that occupied most of the room's center and said nothing, because he genuinely did not know what to say to that. Maggie came in from outside and made coffee in a way that made it clear she had made coffee under difficult circumstances, enough times to do it perfectly regardless of conditions. She set a cup in front of John and one for herself and sat across the table from him, and they looked at each other with the particular directness of 2 people who have established, without formal discussion, that honesty is the operating protocol. "My name is John Shepard," he said. "I'm from East Texas originally. I've been riding west for about 9 years. "Why?" she asked. 9 years and no one had asked him why. They asked where he was going or where he'd been or whether he was looking for work. Nobody asked why. "My wife died," he said, "and my land burned, and I lost my faith in the idea of being in one place." Maggie wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and said, "I'm sorry about your wife." "It was a long time ago," he said. "I was 22. "Does it stop being long ago just because time has passed?" she asked. He thought about that honestly. "No," he said, "I suppose it doesn't." They drank their coffee. Thomas fell asleep on his corner cot with the encyclopedia on his chest. Outside, the desert made its nighttime sounds and a thin moon rose over the mountains, and John did not ride toward California. He stayed that night in the small barn, rolled in his bedroll with Franklin's steady breathing for company, and he lay awake looking at the barn ceiling and thinking about Maggie Walker's hands around the coffee cup and the way she had asked her questions, as though she actually wanted the true answers rather than the comfortable ones. He helped with the farm work the next morning without being asked. He was not a farmer by nature, but he was a capable man, and he could see what needed doing. He repaired a section of fence that had been pulling loose. He checked the mule's left rear hoof, which had been giving the animal trouble, found a small stone embedded in the frog, and removed it. He split a week's worth of firewood from the pile of rough-cut timber stacked against the barn's north wall. Maggie watched him work with the same assessing quality that seemed characteristic of her, not suspicious exactly, but thoughtful. She did not make the mistake of pretending she was not watching, that he appreciated. He was very tired of pretense. After lunch, which was beans and cornbread made with the last of her old flour, she said, "You don't have to work. I didn't invite you here for labor." "I know," he said. "I need to do something with my hands." She seemed to understand this. "Why did you come back?" she asked, not accusatory, genuinely asking. He looked at her and made the decision without particularly planning to answer truthfully. "Because your voice," he said, "when you were talking to Croft, it stopped me. I've been on a lot of roads and I've heard a lot of people under pressure. I've never heard anyone hold on to their dignity that hard without making it a performance. It was the realest thing I've heard in years, and I didn't want to ride past it." Maggie Walker looked at him for a long time. The September light was full and warm, and it caught the angles of her face in a way that made her look both harder and softer simultaneously, which was, John thought, exactly right. "That's a very honest answer," she said finally. "I'm trying to be more honest than I used to be," he said. "What were you before?" "A man who found honesty inconvenient," he said. "Among other things I'm not proud of." She nodded slowly, accepting this without asking him to perform more disclosure than he'd offered. That restraint, that recognition that a person reveals themselves at their own appropriate pace, was one of the first things he came to love about her. He did not know that yet. He was just taking note of it. He spent 3 more days at the farm. Each day he found more work to do, and each evening they sat at the table after Thomas was asleep and talked. He learned that she was 28 years old, had come west from Missouri with her husband Robert 6 years ago, had built the farm from nothing alongside him, had lost him 14 months ago, and had been holding everything together since with a ferocity that she never discussed because she did not think of it as ferocious. She thought of it as the only option available to her. She learned that he had grown up on a small farm in East Texas, that his father had been a taciturn but decent man who taught him to work with his hands, that his wife Clara had died in a fire that also took his crops and his house, and left him standing in ash at 22 with nothing ahead and nothing behind. She learned that he had drifted, taking work where he found it, sometimes honest work and sometimes work that required him not to look too closely at what he was participating in, and that he had spent the better part of the last several years trying to accumulate enough distance from that second category to stop needing to not look at it. "What kind of not honest work?" she asked, on the 3rd night. He looked at the oil lamp between them. "I rode for a man in New Mexico for 2 years. He ran cattle. Some of the cattle were his, some of them weren't." She said nothing. "I wasn't the man who took the cattle that weren't his," he said, "but I knew it was happening and I took the pay." "That's a kind of taking too. Why did you stay?" she asked. "Because the money was reliable and I was tired," he said, "and because I had decided I didn't care what I was anymore." "But you do care," she said. It was not a question. "I do now," he said. "I think I started caring again somewhere on the road to here, but I couldn't tell you exactly where." She looked at him with that deep-seeing quality and said, "I think you cared the whole time. I think you were just angry enough to pretend otherwise." He had no response to that. He filed it away in the place where he put things he needed to think about when he had sufficient quietness. On the morning of the 4th day, 2 men rode up to the farm. John saw them coming from the barn where he was rubbing down Franklin. He recognized the type immediately, the deliberate easiness of men who are confident that their employer's power will smooth most complications. They were dressed practically but well, and they carried themselves with the particular looseness of men accustomed to operating without consequence. One of them called out to the house before dismounting. Maggie came to the door. "Morning, Mrs. Walker," said the taller one, whose name John would learn was Vickers. "Mr. Croft wanted us to remind you that the note on this property comes due at end of month." "I'm aware of when the note comes due," Maggie said from the doorway. "Mr. Croft also wanted to mention that if you're having difficulty meeting it, he'd be happy to discuss arrangements. He's a fair man." "He is not a fair man," Maggie said calmly and clearly, "and I don't need his arrangements." The second man, who was shorter and broader, had been looking toward the barn. He spotted John leaning against the door frame, and something shifted in his expression, a recalculation of the situation. "Who's that?" he asked. "That's my farmhand," Maggie said, without missing a beat, which startled John slightly even from a distance. The two men exchanged a look. Vickers looked at John steadily for a moment, then tipped his hat to Maggie with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Tell your farmhand he picked an interesting place to work, Mrs. Walker. Mr. Croft will be by to discuss the note personally before month's end." They rode off. John walked over to the house. Thomas had appeared at Maggie's elbow, vibrating with the contained intensity of a child who has heard things he understands better than adults give him credit for. "Farmhand," John said. Maggie met his eyes. "I was improvising. They'll think twice about certain things if they believe there's a man regularly on the property." "Is that what you want? For them to think twice?" "I want that note paid," she said. "I want Gerald Croft to lose interest in my land. I want to be left alone to work my farm and raise my son. What I want is entirely reasonable and entirely impossible given current conditions, which means I manage with what's available." John looked at the road the men had ridden off on. The implications of what Harriet Chen had told him rearranged themselves in his mind into something with sharper edges. "How much is the note?" he asked. She told him. It was not an enormous sum by some standards, but it was an astronomical sum for a woman alone on a small farm with a dead husband and a 6-year-old, and a crop that had come in 40% short due to drought. "I have some money," he said. "No," she said immediately. "Let me finish. I have some money that I've never spent. I've been writing for 9 years and I live like I live. I have enough to cover the note." "John," she said his name for the first time. He noticed this. "I am not going to let you pay my debt. That's a different category from flower money. I won't owe you that." "What if it wasn't owing?" he said. "What if it was a partnership?" She looked at him with that direct gaze. "What kind of partnership?" "I stay," he said. "I work the farm, we split whatever comes off it." The silence between them was dense with all the things that word stay implied and the things neither of them were ready to say. "You were going west," she said. "West is a big place," he said deliberately, and watched something happen in her eyes. She was quiet for a long time. Thomas looked between them with his 6-year-old acuity, taking notes. "You can stay through winter," she said finally. "We'll see." He paid the note the next morning. He did it at the bank in town, not through Croft directly, which meant Croft learned about it after the fact in a way that gave him less room to apply pressure. John had learned some things about how men like Croft operated over 9 years on various roads, and one of them was that they disliked being outmaneuvered on the administrative level almost as much as on the physical level. Croft found him outside the bank afterward. He was civil. He was the specific kind of civil that is calibrated to communicate threat without providing anything actionable. "You're the Walker woman's new hand," Croft said. "I work with her," John said. "Not for her." He had made that distinction carefully. "It's a hard place to make a go of it," Croft said. "For a widow and one man, that lands more work than it's worth." "That's for the people working it to determine," John said. Croft smiled. "You planning to stay permanent, Shepard?" He had not given Croft his name. He noted this. "I might," he said. "Things have a way of not working out for people who put themselves between me and what I'm working toward," Croft said pleasantly. "Is that so?" John said without inflection, meeting Croft's eyes. After a moment, Croft nodded, turned, and walked away. John stood outside the bank in the September sun, and felt the familiar awareness of danger that had kept him alive through 9 complicated years, and alongside it, for the first time in those 9 years, something that felt like purpose. October came in dry and gold. John built a proper table for the main room of the farmhouse, using lumber he bartered for with a week of labor at the mill east of town. He was not a carpenter by training, but he was precise and patient, and the table came out solid and level, and Maggie ran her hand along the surface when she saw it with an expression he did not see her wear often, something unguarded. He and Thomas developed a particular friendship, the kind that forms between a careful man and a perceptive child, built largely on books. Thomas had 3 books besides the encyclopedia: a Bible, a collection of Shakespeare's plays that his grandfather Thomas Sr. had carried through the war and sent home when he died of wounds at Cold Harbor in 1864, and a slim volume of poems by Emily Dickinson that his mother had brought from Missouri. Thomas read all of them with indiscriminate intensity and discussed them with whoever was available, which now included John, who had read less than Thomas in his life but thought carefully when he did read, which Thomas respected. John and Maggie grew into each other the way desert plants grow into rock, slowly, finding the cracks, establishing roots that go deeper than they appear. They did not rush anything. The situation they were in was too complicated for rushing, and they were both people who had been damaged by moving faster than circumstances warranted. But there were moments. A mid-October evening when a sudden cold front came down from the mountains, and John was outside covering the garden beds against frost, and Maggie came out to help, and they worked side by side in the cold blue dark, their breath making small clouds, and when they finished, she stood close enough that he could feel the warmth of her through the cold air, and he turned and found her face right there, and neither of them moved for several seconds that contained more than hours usually do. She went inside. He finished the covering, but something had shifted between them with the permanence of geography. Croft's men came by twice more in October, each time to deliver messages framed as friendly reminders. Each time John was visible on the property. Each time the exchange was brief and cool. But John could feel the situation's pressure building the way you feel weather before you see it, in the air itself, in the behavior of animals. In early November, the trouble escalated. John found the garden fence destroyed one morning, the posts pulled up and the wire rolled back. Some of the late-season crop had been trampled. He read the scene the way a man trained to read scenes reads it: horses, multiple sets, work done at night deliberately and quietly. He did not have proof of who had ordered it, but proof and knowledge were different things. He rode into town and visited Harriet Chen, who was his reliable source of information on all things Croft-related. She told him that Croft had been visited that week by 2 land investors from Santa Fe who were interested in the creek property, which meant Croft's timeline had accelerated. He needed the Walker farm and its water rights sooner rather than later. "He's going to get worse," Harriet said flatly. "I know," John said. "What are you going to do?" He thought about it. He had resources that he was reluctant to deploy, but that existed. 9 years on difficult roads had given him a particular set of connections, men he had worked alongside, some honest and some less so, who owed him things or respected him or both. He had been avoiding calling on any of that because calling on it meant acknowledging that part of who he was. But he had also, over the past 2 months in that farmhouse, been reconsidering his relationship with his own history. He sent 2 letters from the Harlow's Crossing post office before he rode back. One to a man named Samuel Price in Tucson, who was a lawyer with a specific interest in property rights, and a personal dislike of Gerald Croft stemming from a business dispute 8 years prior. One to a man named Pete Gallagher in Albuquerque, who was currently a legitimate cattle broker but who had connections to the territorial marshal's office. He rode back to the farm and told Maggie what he'd done. She listened without interrupting, which was one of her great qualities. She let information finish arriving before she responded to it. "You have a lawyer in Tucson," she said. "I know Samuel Price. He's a good man and he knows property law in the territory. And the other one, Pete Gallagher, can get information to the territorial marshal. Pullman is Croft's man, but the territorial marshal isn't, and if there's documented interference with property rights on record, it's harder for Croft to operate. She looked at him. You've thought about this carefully. I've had some practice with situations where powerful men use their local advantage to override other people's rights, he said, on various roads. Was that the not honest work you mentioned? Some of it I observed from the outside. He paused. I want to be clear about something. I know how this looks. I know you might wonder whether I've got hidden motives of my own. Do you? She asked. I want you to keep your farm, he said. I want Thomas to grow up here, and he stopped and then said it, I want to stop leaving places. The fire in the hearth spoke for a moment in the silence. John, she said quietly. You don't have to say anything, he said. I'm not asking for anything. I'm telling you where I stand so there's no hidden motive to wonder about. Everything I do here I do because I want to. There's no trap in it. She looked at him for a long time with that seeing look. Then she said, I know that. I knew it the day you rode back from 4 miles down the road with a sack of flour and salt candy for my son. He felt the breath go out of him in a way he had not felt in a very long time. Thomas appeared from his corner cot where he had allegedly been asleep for an hour. Are you two in love? He asked with perfect 7-year-old directness. He had turned 7 in October with a small celebration that had included the stick candy and a story John made up about a wandering knight who found a kingdom worth staying in. Thomas, Maggie said. I'm just asking, Thomas said, because you both get a different kind of quiet around each other than you do around other people. I've been observing it. Go to sleep, Maggie said. Thomas went, with the expression of a scientist who has successfully collected data and is satisfied to await further developments. John looked at the table he had built, running his thumb along the edge of it. He's not wrong about the quiet, he said. No, Maggie said. He's not wrong. November moved through them. The first real cold came, and John winterized the barn as best he could with available materials and traded labor with the Navarro family, whose patriarch Jose Navarro was a quietly formidable man who had been watching the Croft situation with the particular attention of someone who understood what it meant when powerful people decided that rules did not apply to them. Jose's wife Maria brought food when she came, tamales and tortillas and a rich red chili that made Thomas's eyes water and delighted him completely. The two families shared meals and labor across November, and the warmth of that community was something John had not experienced in 9 years and had forgotten was possible. Samuel Price wrote back from Tucson. He was interested. More specifically, he was interested in the pattern of Croft's property acquisitions over the past 6 years, which Price had been building a case around based on complaints from other people Croft had displaced. The Walker farm, with its documented water rights and its recent history of pressure, could be an important piece of a larger legal argument. Price was coming to Harlow's Crossing in December. The letter from Pete Gallagher was less encouraging on the immediate front. The territorial marshal had too many active situations to dedicate attention to a property dispute in a small settlement, but Gallagher had made it known that the situation was being observed, which was its own kind of protection. Croft found out about Price within 3 days of Price's response letter arriving at the post office. John did not know how. Small towns carried information like water carried minerals, invisibly and thoroughly. The reaction was immediate. 2 of Croft's men stopped by the farm on a Thursday morning, and this time the visit was less civil. Vickers told John, while Maggie stood in the doorway of the house with Thomas behind her, that Mr. Croft took a particular view of people who involved outside legal interests in what were, in Mr. Croft's view, private business matters between neighbors. John said that he looked forward to presenting that view to Samuel Price, who was a licensed attorney in the territory with an active interest in the property rights of settlers being illegally pressured. Vickers looked at him for a long time. John looked back. He had spent a significant portion of 9 years in situations where looking away first had consequences, and he had developed an extremely effective stillness. Eventually, Vickers and his companion rode off. Maggie came out to stand beside John and they watched the dust settle after the horses. "This is going to get worse before it gets better," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm not afraid," she said. But then she added, with the honesty that was characteristic of her, "I'm worried about Thomas." He turned to look at her. She was looking at the road, her jaw set, her hands loose at her sides, and he saw the full weight of what she carried as a single mother in a territory that did not provide much in the way of nets for people who fell, and he felt something so fierce and protective move through him that it took his breath. "Thomas is not going to be hurt," he said. "I will make sure of it." She looked at him. "You can't promise that." "I know," he said. "I'm promising it anyway." She held his gaze, and he watched something move in her eyes that he would think about for a long time afterward, a combination of terror and trust, the particular vulnerability of someone who has decided to believe in a promise even knowing that promises live in an uncertain world. She reached out and took his hand, just for a moment. Then she went back inside. He stood in the cold November air and looked at his hand and felt the warmth she had left in it. December brought Samuel Price, who arrived on the stage from Tucson on the 15th and was the most out-of-place person John had seen in Harlow's Crossing. A compact, precise man of perhaps 45 with a suit that had been pressed for travel, and a leather case of documents that he clutched with the devotion of a man who understood that paper, correctly assembled, was the most powerful weapon in a civilization's arsenal. Price met with Maggie for 3 hours at the table John had built. John sat in on part of it and walked Senator the mule around the yard for part of it, giving them privacy for the portions that seemed to require it. What emerged from the meeting was a clearer picture of the legal situation and a specific strategy. Croft's pattern across 6 years had involved pressuring settlers on strategically located land until they either sold or abandoned, then purchasing the land at minimal cost. He had done it at least 4 times before the Walker farm. In most cases, the settlers had not had legal representation. In one case, where a man named Hiram Cole had consulted a lawyer, Croft had moved faster and harder, and Cole's barn had burned under circumstances that were suspicious but unprovable. Price wanted to document the pattern and present it collectively to the territorial court. It would take time. Several months at minimum. In the interim, the strategy was to create as much documented legal visibility around Maggie's situation as possible, making any further pressure from Croft a matter of official record and therefore harder to sustain. "The risk," Price said, looking at both of them with his precise lawyerly gaze, "is that Croft sees the documentation coming and acts before it does." "Acts how?" Maggie asked. "Faster, more directly. The barn fire strategy." The word fire landed on John with its particular weight. He had his own history with fire. "We'll be careful," he said. "You'll need to be very careful," Price said. "And I would recommend never leaving the property entirely unoccupied." He stayed 2 days, gathered his documentation, and rode back to Tucson on the stage. John reorganized his thinking about the situation in light of Price's assessment. He had not, before this, been operating with genuine urgency about the physical risk. Now he was. He made some adjustments, quieter arrangements, a better watch rotation at night, the removal of certain supplies to a location that was not the barn, and a quiet conversation with Jose Navarro about mutual aid arrangements if things deteriorated. Jose listened with the gravity of a man who had seen enough of the territory to know that John's concern was rational. "We are 4 men on this property," Jose said, referring to himself and his 3 sons, the oldest of whom was 19. "If you need us, you send Thomas and we come." It was December 21st when everything came apart, as John had known it would, just not quite in the way he had anticipated. He had gone into town that afternoon for the post office and to purchase Christmas supplies, a small, deliberate act of normalcy that he was determined to maintain for Thomas's sake. He was returning on Franklin as the sun hit the horizon when he smelled it. Smoke. He put Franklin into a full gallop. The distance between the town and the farm was a little over a mile, and Franklin ate it. He came around the last rise and saw the barn on fire, the dry December wind pulling the flames into something fast and hungry. The house was not burning yet. He could see Maggie in the yard, throwing bucket after bucket of water at the fence line between the barn and the house, preventing the fire from bridging. Senator the mule had been released and was standing at a frantic distance near the garden fence. The two chickens were nowhere. The milk cow, he would learn later, Maggie had released the moment she smelled the smoke. Thomas was on the well, operating the pump with both arms, filling buckets as fast as his 7-year-old body could manage. John came off Franklin while the horse was still moving, hit the ground and went immediately to Thomas at the pump. "Keep pumping," he said, taking buckets from Thomas and running them to Maggie, who threw them without pausing, without speaking, with a focused ferocity that was beautiful and devastating to watch. They lost the barn, but they saved the house. By the time the fire burned down to the stone foundation with nothing left to consume, the house stood intact, and the three of them stood in the yard in the cold December night covered in ash and smelling of smoke, and Maggie made a sound that was not quite a sob, contained almost immediately, just one single involuntary sound of grief for the thing she had lost. John put his arm around her. She was rigid with effort for a moment, the reflex of someone who has learned not to lean, and then something let go and she leaned into him, and he held her while the barn's remains smoked in the cold. Thomas pressed against his mother's other side, and she wrapped her free arm around him. They stood like that in the darkness for a long time. He left them sleeping and spent the night sitting awake outside the house with his rifle, but nothing came. The message had been the fire. Croft was demonstrating capability without yet moving to the next level. It was a trap designed to make them feel exposed, to make the option of selling feel safer than staying. John wrote to Samuel Price the next morning. Then he went to the Navarro farm and talked to Jose. Then he went back to the farmhouse and found Maggie at the table with a piece of paper in front of her on which she had been making lists. He looked at the lists and saw that she was, characteristically, assessing what remained rather than cataloging what was lost. "Thomas is sleeping," she said without looking up. "He was up most of the night. He heard everything even though he didn't say so." "He's a tough kid," John said. "He's 7, she said. There was an edge in it, not directed at John, directed at the world for being the kind of world where a 7-year-old needed to be tough. "Maggie." He sat across from her. "I need to ask you something." She looked up. "Do you want to keep fighting this?" he asked. "I'm not asking because I think you should stop. I'm asking because it needs to be your choice and I want to make sure you're choosing it clearly, knowing what it might still cost." She looked at him for a long time. "This farm is what Robert and I built," she said. "It's the only thing Thomas has of his father, and if Croft takes it, he takes it from every person in this valley who he's decided doesn't matter." She paused. "I'm not leaving." "Good," he said. "But I want to know," she said, and her voice was very steady, "why you're still here, John. Really why?" "Because you came in September with no plans to stay, and now it's December and my barn is ash and things are not getting easier. You could ride west. You could still ride west." He looked at the table he had built. He looked at the list she had made. He looked at her face, the dark eyes and the wide mouth and the quality of controlled strength that had stopped him on the road months ago. "I love you," he said. The simplicity of it seemed to startle her. She had perhaps expected something more complicated, more hedged. He had surprised himself with the simplicity of it too. But it was true, and being true it was simple, and he had made a commitment to being more honest than he used to be. The silence was very full. "I've been trying to decide," she said slowly, "whether what I feel for you is love or whether it's something simpler than that, gratitude and relief that someone reliable appeared at a very difficult time." "And," he said, "I think," she said, "that I've been dishonest with myself because love felt too dangerous to acknowledge." "It is dangerous," he said. "I know. I loved someone before and I lost her and it broke something in me that took 9 years to start mending. I'm not pretending it isn't dangerous. But you're saying it anyway. I'm trying to be more honest than I used to be, he said again. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, not briefly this time. I love you too, she said. I have for a while. I just needed you to say it first because I'm too practical to jump off a cliff before I know there's someone falling alongside me. He turned his hand over beneath hers and held it. Thomas appeared from the corner cot. He stood and surveyed them with his encyclopedic expression. Good, he said. I was starting to think the two of you were going to make me wait until spring. The situation with Croft moved toward its resolution through January and February, and it was not simple or clean. Price was building his legal case, and it was nearly complete, but Croft, who had informants in Tucson as well as in Harlow's Crossing, knew the net was closing, and men who see a net closing tend to act. In late January, Vickers and 3 other men came to the farm on a morning when John was riding to the Navarro farm and Maggie was alone with Thomas. They did not threaten her physically. They offered her a price for the land in writing that was below market value, and they made it clear that the offer would not be improving and that the alternative to accepting it was a continuation of the previous pattern at an accelerating rate. Maggie asked them to leave. They left. When John returned and she told him, he felt the dark heat of something he had been controlling for months flare up. I should have been here, he said. They didn't touch us, she said. They came here while you were alone and they pressured you. That's enough. He paused, breathing through the anger. Did Thomas see? Thomas was reading in the corner, she said. He heard everything. John found Thomas sitting with his encyclopedia and sat beside him. The boy looked up with his father's eyes, his mother's eyes dark and observant. You all right? John asked. Thomas thought about it honestly, the way he considered everything. I didn't like those men, he said. They speak to Mama as if she isn't the most capable person in any room. She is, John said. She's the strongest person, Thomas said with great confidence. She does everything. She does, John agreed. Thomas looked at him. Are you going to make them stop? We're going to make them stop, John said. All of us together. It's going to take a little longer. Thomas nodded and returned to his encyclopedia. The resolution, when it came through law and not through violence, which was what John had worked toward and what Price had been building. In mid-February, Price filed the consolidated case in the territorial court in Tucson, documenting Croft's 6-year pattern of coercive land acquisition, with supporting testimony from 4 former settlers including Hiram Cole, who had never stopped being angry about his burned barn. The territorial marshal's office opened a formal investigation. Croft's response was to try to sell his position as quickly as possible to the Santa Fe investors and leave the territory before the investigation could attach to him personally. He very nearly succeeded. But Pete Gallagher, whose connections in Albuquerque included people who monitored unusual property transfers, flagged the sale, and a hold was placed on Croft's assets pending the investigation's conclusion. Croft was still in Harlow's Crossing in March when the marshal's deputies arrived. He was charged with fraudulent land acquisition, destruction of property, and several related counts that Price had carefully constructed to be as bulletproof as possible. He was removed from the territory pending trial in Tucson. Vickers and his men scattered when Croft was charged, which was the behavior John had predicted. The town of Harlow's Crossing let out a collective breath that John suspected it had been holding for 6 years. On the day that Croft was removed, Harriet Chen brought a bottle of wine she had been keeping for exactly this kind of occasion, and the Walker farm had its first genuine celebration. The Navarros came. Harriet came. Thomas was allowed to stay up past his normal bedtime, and he drank cider and observed the adult proceedings with his characteristic scientific intensity. John looked across the room at Maggie, who was laughing at something Maria Navarro had said, the laugh open and full and unguarded in a way he had not seen before, because she had never before been in a situation where laughing fully felt safe. He watched her and felt something settle in his chest with the permanence of a stone finding its place in a wall. Spring came to the Walker farm as it comes to desert country, abruptly and with extravagant color. The ocotillo bloomed. The palo verde went yellow. The garden came back stronger than the previous year, partly because John had spent the winter improving the irrigation channels, and partly because Maggie's understanding of her soil was by now extremely sophisticated. They built a new barn. It took 3 weeks, with Jose Navarro's family and 2 other men from town who came because they wanted to, and because the community had a new feeling in it now that the gravitational weight of Croft's presence had been removed. The new barn was better than the old one, better sited, better ventilated, with a loft that Thomas immediately claimed as a reading space. John proposed to Maggie on an April evening when the desert was doing everything it could with the light and the air and the distant sound of a nighthawk working the sky. He had not planned a speech. He said simply that he wanted to stop being the man passing through and be the man who was here, officially and permanently, if she would have him. She said yes with the same directness she brought to everything. No excessive performance of surprise, no lengthy deliberation, just a clear and honest yes, delivered while looking at him in that seeing way, followed by a kiss that contained 9 years of roads and 14 months of grief, and 4 months of trust building its foundations in hard ground. Thomas, who had been sitting in the loft of the new barn and had observed the entire thing through the loft door, made a noise of satisfaction that made them both look up and then laugh. "You could have given us some privacy," Maggie called up to him. "I wanted to make sure you were doing it right," Thomas said. They were married in June of 1882 at the small church in Harlow's Crossing, in a ceremony conducted by the Reverend Morrison, who was one of the people whose debt Croft had held, and who was visibly relieved to conduct a ceremony that was entirely free of complicated obligation. Harriet Chen and Maria Navarro stood beside Maggie. Jose Navarro stood beside John. Thomas stood with both of them simultaneously, moving between the 2 positions as he saw fit, which seemed to John to be exactly right. The judge in Tucson ruled against Croft in August, and Croft was required to pay restitution to the settlers he had displaced, which Price administered with meticulous care. It was not enormous money for each person, but it was acknowledgement, which Price understood mattered more than the money for most of them. The Walker farm, which John thought of increasingly as simply the Shepard farm, and Maggie still called the Walker farm out of loyalty to what she and Robert had built, expanded that summer. They added 10 acres to the east, land that came available when a family moved north toward Colorado. John turned out to be a better farmer than he had expected, which he attributed to patience, the one quality 9 years of roads had given him in abundance. Thomas turned 8 in October and received his most valued birthday present, a proper set of school books, because Maggie had lobbied successfully for a school to be established in Harlow's Crossing, a campaign she had been waging since before John's arrival, and which finally succeeded in the summer of 1882. The teacher was a woman named Caroline Bright, who had come from Ohio, and who found in Thomas exactly the kind of student who makes a teacher's decision to come west feel entirely worthwhile. Winter was different that year from all the winters John had spent on roads. He had a place to come back to. He had a fire that was specifically his fire, a table he had built, a woman who said his name with the particular timbre that it only has when it means something. He had a boy who showed him things from books and asked him questions that required real thought. One evening in December, Thomas looked up from his books and said, with the abruptness that characterized his best observations, "John." "Yes." "When you came to our farm, were you looking for us specifically, or did we happen to you?" John considered this carefully, the way Thomas's questions always deserved. "You happened to me," he said. "But I think some things happened to you because you've been moving in the right direction for long enough to arrive where they are." Thomas turned this over. "So you were going the right direction, but you didn't know it." "Exactly," John said. Thomas seemed satisfied. He went back to his book. Maggie, across the room, had looked up from her mending during this exchange. she and John met each other's eyes. She smiled, that full, open smile that had emerged properly after Croft was removed, and now lived on her face with the comfortable regularity it deserved. He smiled back and looked at the fire and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that he was entirely and precisely in the right place. It was in February of 1883 that Maggie told him she was expecting their first child. She told him the way she did everything directly, without excessive ceremony, at breakfast over coffee, with Thomas sitting between them reading a school primer. He looked at her and said nothing for a long moment. "Are you all right?" she asked, watching him. "More than all right," he said. Thomas looked up from his primer. He calculated. "I'm going to have a brother or a sister." "It looks that way," Maggie said. Thomas considered. "I would prefer a brother, but I will be equally committed to a sister," he said, in the manner of someone establishing a position while remaining open to facts. He returned to his primer. John reached across the table and put his hand over Maggie's. "How are you feeling?" "Sick in the mornings," she said practically. "Otherwise fine. I expect it will be similar to Thomas, who was extremely determined about everything from the beginning." The spring and summer of 1883 were full and good and demanding. The farm was producing well. John had taken on a small amount of occasional work as a ranch hand for a legitimate cattle operation 2 days' ride south, work that provided extra income during the slow agricultural months, and that he did carefully, always home when he said he would be, because he understood that Maggie's particular kind of strength had limits like anyone else's, and one of those limits was men who did not come home when they said they would. The baby came in September of 1883, a boy, healthy and loud, with John's brown eyes and Maggie's angular face, which on an infant was somewhat more alarming than it would eventually become, but which John found immediately perfect. They named him Robert James Shepard, the Robert for Maggie's first husband, which John had suggested without hesitation, because it was the right thing and he had no hidden motive about it, and the James for John's father, who had been a decent man. Thomas examined the baby with scientific detachment for approximately 48 hours, and then fell completely in love with him in the way that careful people fall when they finally commit, totally and without reservation. He read to Robert James from the very first days, sitting beside the cradle John had built from cedar, reading from the encyclopedia in his careful 7-year-old voice, because Thomas had determined that there was no reason to wait to begin the baby's education. Maggie watched this and looked at John with an expression he had never quite seen on her face before, layered and warm, something that encompassed Thomas and Robert James and him, and the table and the barn and the farm, and the whole complicated fact of the life they had assembled from hard materials. "Are you happy?" he asked her quietly. She turned to look at him, and there was nothing complicated in her expression now, just the answer. "Yes," she said. He kissed her and she kissed him back, and Thomas said from the cradle, without looking up from the encyclopedia, "Good." Time moved the way time moves in good places, with the specific density of a life that is actually being lived. Robert James grew from a loud infant into an active toddler, who followed Thomas everywhere with the devoted intensity of a younger sibling, who has identified his hero. Thomas, for his part, took the responsibility seriously and could be heard, from various points around the farm, explaining to Robert James the properties of soil, the migratory patterns of birds, and the major themes of Shakespeare, in the patient and precise manner of someone who has given these subjects considerable thought. John taught Thomas to ride properly in the spring of 1884, patient lessons in the South field on a gentle horse they acquired for the purpose, a gray mare that Thomas named Copernicus, after the astronomer. Thomas took to riding with the same serious dedication he brought to reading, and by summer he could handle Copernicus through fairly demanding terrain. Maggie taught Thomas to cook, which was also practical, and which Thomas approached with the same encyclopedic thoroughness, comparing cooking times and techniques with the logic of experimentation. The farm grew. The town grew. Harlow's Crossing, without the gravitational pull of Croft's particular brand of power, began to develop with more balance, more voices having room to exist. A second family from Mexico arrived and joined the Navarros as a significant presence in the community. The school expanded. A proper post office was established, separate from the general store, which was now run by Harriet Chen, who had purchased it from Croft's liquidated estate at a price that satisfied her sense of justice and her economic calculations simultaneously. John had been tracking, quietly and without urgency, the outstanding questions from his past. The matter of the 9 years, the work he was not proud of, the things he had participated in through absence of objection. He had written letters, made what small amends were available to make. He had been honest with Maggie about all of it, because their marriage was built on honesty and he was not going to compromise the foundation. She listened. She asked questions. She did not forgive in the cheap way that smooths things over without accounting for them, but she forgave in the real way which acknowledges the thing fully and then releases it. "The man you were," she said once on a winter evening, "was the road that brought you here. I'm not going to wish the road away." He thought about that for a long time. In the late spring of 1885 they had a second child, this time a girl. They named her Clara Ann Shepard, the Clara for John's first wife, which Maggie had suggested with a kindness that cut him in the best possible way, and the Ann for Maggie's mother, who had died before Thomas was born, and whom Maggie missed with the quiet, persistent missing that never fully resolves. Clara was born with her mother's dark eyes and her father's particular stillness, and from her earliest days she watched the world with an attention that felt evaluative. Thomas declared her magnificent after their first real interaction, which occurred when Clara was 3 months old, and grabbed his offered finger and held on. Thomas turned to John with an expression of profound vindication. "She's going to be formidable," Thomas said. "Yes," John agreed. Robert James was unimpressed for approximately a week, then decided Clara was the most interesting thing on the farm and appointed himself her primary protector, a role he would maintain with magnificent seriousness for the rest of their childhood. The farm in summer was a full and vivid place. The garden had expanded to include sections managed by each child with varying degrees of agricultural success. Thomas's section was organized with scientific precision. Robert James's section was enthusiastic and slightly chaotic but productive. Clara, at 2, had a section consisting of 2 square feet of carefully maintained dirt in which she grew radishes with tremendous dedication. John watched his family from the fence of the south field one August evening in 1886. The light going that particular deep gold of August evenings in the desert, Maggie moving between the garden rows, Thomas at the well, Robert James chasing a chicken, who had escaped its fence with the optimistic energy of a 5-year-old. Clara sitting precisely in the middle of the yard watching Robert James, with scientific detachment clearly inherited from her older brother. He had left East Texas at 22 with nothing, and he had ridden 9 years, and he had arrived at this, at exactly this, at this farm and this family, and this woman who he loved with the simple and total clarity that had surprised him the day he said it out loud, that remained simple and total because it was real and not performed. Maggie looked up from the garden and found him at the fence, and held his gaze across the warm August air. And the look between them was the look that forms between two people who have built something real together and know it. He walked back through the gate and into the yard, and she met him at the edge of the garden, and he put his arms around her there in the August evening while the children made their various sounds around them, and she put her head against his shoulder, and they stood together in the middle of the life they had made. "I never thanked you properly," she said, against his shoulder. "For what?" "For turning around," she said. 4 miles down the road, for turning around." He rested his chin on her hair and looked at the farm, the adobe house they had added a full second room onto, the solid new barn where Senator the mule stood content at the door, the garden, the south field going golden in the late light, Thomas reading in the barn loft, Robert James finally capturing the errant chicken in a triumph he announced to the entire property, Clara applauding from the middle of the yard. "West is a big place," he said. "I didn't need all of it." She laughed that full open laugh, and he held her, and the desert evening held them both. 3 weeks later, on a warm September morning that marked exactly 4 years since John Shepard rode into a general store and set 2 dimes on a counter, Maggie sat at the table John had built and told him over breakfast that there would be a 4th child in the spring. Thomas looked up from his primer. Robert James, who was 5 and had developed an excellent sense of the room, looked between his parents with bright eyes. "Is this good news?" Robert James asked. "Very good news," John said. Clara, from her chair, reached across and patted her father's hand with great seriousness, apparently agreeing that this was appropriate. That evening, after the children were in their corners and the lamp was burning low, John and Maggie sat at the table together as they had sat on that first night in September 4 years ago, with their coffee and the fire and the desert making its nighttime sounds outside. And they talked with the ease and depth of 2 people who have learned to know each other through hard circumstances and good ones and all the ordinary days between, which are ultimately where a life is actually built. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He looked around the room, the table he had built, the books on the shelf, Thomas's encyclopedia, the Shakespeare, the Dickinson, now joined by school readers and agricultural manuals, and a compendium of Western law that Price had sent as a gift. The children's things in the corners. The cradle, waiting, moved back out from storage when Maggie told him the news, the cedar cradle he had built before Robert James was born. "I'm thinking," he said, "that I spent 9 years not knowing what I was moving toward, and now I know, and it turns out it was worth every road." Maggie looked at him across the low lamp. She had the small smile, the one that was not quite the big open laugh but was in some ways more intimate, the one she reserved for moments between them. "You always were going in the right direction," she said. "You just needed enough road." He reached across and took her hand and held it on the table, her hand that had thrown bucket after bucket at a burning barn without stopping, that had worked this land for years before he arrived, that had extended itself to him on that November evening when she let him know without words that she had decided to trust the promise, her strong and honest hand. The fire spoke. The desert spoke. The lamp burned. Outside, the desert that had seen 1,000 stories of people trying and failing and trying again, breathed its ancient dry breath over the Walker Shepard farm, and the stars came out in their extravagance. And everything that had been broken was mended, and everything that had been lost was accounted for, and everything that needed to be found had been found on the road, as things worth finding usually are. In the spring, the 4th child was born, another boy, whom they named Samuel Joseph Shepard, the Samuel for Price, who had spent his legal expertise in service of something real, and who was genuinely moved by the honor when Maggie wrote to tell him, and the Joseph for Jose Navarro, who had shown up with his sons and his solidarity when the barn burned, and who continued to be the kind of neighbor that made a place a community rather than just a collection of properties. Samuel Joseph was born on a morning when the Palo Verde was in full yellow bloom and the desert smelled of rain that had fallen the night before, and he arrived with a shout that woke everyone in the house and sent Robert James and Clara into immediate excited chaos, and made Thomas look up from his current book with an expression of deeply satisfied anticipation. John held his wife's hand throughout, and then held his 4th child in the morning light, this new small person, red-faced and loud and perfect. Thomas stood beside him and examined the baby with his familiar scientific attention. After a moment he said, "He has your chin." "Does he?" John looked. "And Mama's determination," Thomas added, as Samuel Joseph continued to make his views on the world known at considerable volume. John looked at Maggie, who lay back against her pillow with the exhausted and luminous expression of a woman who has done an extraordinary thing and knows it. She met his eyes and the expression softened into something entirely for him. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. The farm that had been built from hard land and stubbornness and grief had become something else entirely, not by replacing what it had been but by growing through and beyond it, the way the best things grow, by becoming more than they started as while remaining true to their foundations. Robert Walker's farm, become Maggie's farm in grief and survival, become their farm in love and partnership and the slow daily work of building a shared life, become the place where 4 children grew up with books and gardens, and the knowledge that the people who loved them were people who had chosen to be there, had turned around when they could have kept writing, had stayed when staying was hard, because some things are worth staying for. John Shepard, who had ridden west for 9 years with a dark past and a hollow heart and a horse with terrible manners, stayed. He stayed and he worked and he loved and he was known, and being known, he was no longer hollow, and the dark past was the road that had brought him to the right place, and the road was done. On an ordinary Tuesday in October, 4 years after all of it had started, John found himself in the barn replacing a section of the new south fence, and Thomas came out from the house looking for him. Thomas was 11 now, still reading everything available to him, still moving through the world with that quality of precise and observant attention that had characterized him from the very beginning. He would be tall when he finished growing, with his mother's angular face and his grandfather's name and his own particular brand of grace that was entirely his own. He came into the barn and said, "Robert James is asking whether you'll come look at the chicken that he thinks has a hurt foot." "I'll come," John said, setting down the tools. They walked across the yard together, man and boy, the October light doing its particular work on the desert, and Robert James was crouching by the chicken yard with little Clara beside him, and Samuel Joseph, who at 6 months had achieved mobility of a sort and was sitting in a patch of sun looking satisfied with the view, and Maggie was coming around from the garden side with her hands full of late herbs. And the whole scene was so entirely ordinary and entirely right that John stopped for a moment and just took it in. Thomas stopped beside him and looked at him with those dark eyes. "What?" Thomas asked. "Nothing," John said. "Everything." Thomas followed his gaze across the yard. He nodded slowly. "We're pretty good, aren't we?" Thomas said. It was not quite a question. "We're very good," John said. They went to look at the chicken's foot together, and the day continued, full and good and ordinary, which is what every extraordinary thing eventually becomes when it is truly yours, and ordinariness was the best thing John Shepard had ever found on any road.